We're going to go through some stuff about working with Angular inside SharePoint, but before we get started, topic we're going to discuss is building SharePoint single-page apps, or building single-page apps for SharePoint or Office 365, really anything, using Angular. So how many of you have played with Angular before? A couple of you have played with it. How many of you have never heard of Angular? Right, a couple of people. How many of you have heard of it, but you're like, oh my God, that thing looks hard, I don't really want to get into it? Okay, so my name is Andrew Connell. You're going to find the slides and all the demos up on a GitHub repository that I've got the link right there, and I will also show it at the very end as well. It's pretty easy to get to. If you just go to github.com/AndrewConnell and just look through the repositories, you'll see one that says pres-sp15app-ng-spa. So you can go grab that. Everything's up there. If you're not familiar with Git or GitHub, there's a little link in there that says download zip, and you can go grab everything. So before I kind of dive into this and start talking about what this stuff is, it's a little bio page. You can see who I am. It's not important. Let me kind of just tell you a quick little story of kind of where I fit or where I see this whole thing going. When I first came out of college, I went to go work for a classic little web startup, and I started working with web applications, building web apps. And at the time, they told me I had to do everything in Java, which was a really good way to really try and push me back to my finance major and get me out of web development. But we started to build a bunch of applications, and I was building this bespoke style application where we called it Adminet, and we had basically a way for us to do a content management system, and you would build, you had a website, and the website would create a little iframe on the fly and submit data to the iframe, and then the iframe would do its work, or the ASP.NET, sorry, the ASP, classic ASP, we're going like way back, would process the request, it would build a response back in a delimited string, would write that out to the screen, but it would be hidden away in the iframe, and then the hosting page would pull that data back out. I had no idea at the time I was doing something called Ajax and single-page apps, because this was 15, 20 years ago, not to date myself. But yeah, I had no idea what was going on there. I loved building these kind of applications, though, because we were building web-based applications, there was nothing to install, and I was giving a rich experience to the users, not some classic page, full-page refresh. I got a little distracted, did this little thing called SharePoint for about 10 years, and then started going more in the web space when I saw the way Office 365 and SharePoint 2013 were going, which is Microsoft essentially telling all of us developers, get out of SharePoint, go do your stuff somewhere else. And a lot of us got all upset about it and got frustrated with it. And then some of us said, you know what? Doesn't matter what I think about it, that's the direction it's going in. So I can either try to complain about it, or I can actually try and embrace this new model of where we're going. About the same time, this thing called Angular started to come out, and as other type of platforms started to come out and frameworks, things like Durandal, there's another one called Ember. What these things are is there's single-page app presentation frameworks. Now, for me, I really like building these applications. And the reason why is because there's nothing to deploy. Your users just need a browser. For the most part, they work in the desktop. They work across different clients. They work in almost any browser, unless you're running IE, which, of course, nothing runs in IE these days, it seems. How many of you are using IE? Have not taken your pills yet, right? It's okay. Same people that are still running Visual Basic, right? I'm just kidding, I'm just kidding. But what we can do is we can build these applications. They're only going to run cross-platform, but they're also going to run on your phone, or they're also going to run on your tablet. Because they're all web-based, they're all traditionally are going to be very responsive the way that they're being built and the way the different frameworks are set up. So what I want to go through is talk a little bit about what are single-page apps, why you should consider this for SharePoint Office 365, some supporting technologies and choices, and then I'm going to jump over to a few demos that I'm going to do. I'm going to try and be brave and do one demo on the fly, build an Angular site on the fly. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this one topic that has got a lot of people bent out of shape, and that's the next version of Angular that's coming down the road. You guys may have heard about this news about the Angular 2.0. A lot of people are like going, oh, this is terrible, I'm building everything that's going to all go under. I have an article that I'm going to have out on my blog and on IT Unity later today or tomorrow that'll go into a lot more depth because it's not something I can go into for just 1 hour. So we'll talk about that at the very end. So first, what are these single-page applications? You've actually used them if you're not familiar with it. These are things like Outlook Web Access, or the Outlook Web App, or Gmail, or Trello. It's basically, in a very, very cut and dry, it's a web page that you go to that doesn't refresh. And instead, what you're essentially doing is you're loading the framework of an application in the browser. It's built 100% using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and images. And what you're going to do is the application is going to reach back to the server, not to refresh the entire page, but based on the context of what you're doing in the application, it's going to just grab a different template and some different data from the server. Maybe do some processing, maybe do some other stuff in the client, but the server is going to only sit there and serve up fragments of pages and data streams. And our application of the client is going to know how to handle all that stuff and build out these different applications for us. All right? So we're essentially constructing or composing an application on the fly in the browser. It's going to really reduce the amount of traffic back and forth to the server because you're going to send less data. You're going to also speed up the application because your users aren't going to feel like this page is waiting to reload. But you can also do some really cool scenarios. Like one that we did, we built an application and actually ran in SharePoint. It was for a construction company. And when they would go work on their buildings, they'd have a trailer where they'd do all the office-style work inside of the trailer where they had Wi-Fi. They'd break open their iPad, they'd go to the application would load, and then they'd go walk out onto the site. They walk in the site and they walk in the application, and they're interacting with the application even though they've lost their internet connection. And the reason they're doing that is because the app was written to cache its data locally inside of the browser until it detected a connection, and when it did, then it sent everything back over the wire and saved it in the back on the SharePoint site, right? It was pretty cool. Worked in any tablet, worked in, some people had laptops, some people used tablets, some people had those big, crazy-looking phones that are as big as your arm, you know, that hold them up next to the side of it. It's like you're holding like a little 32-inch screen next to it, a Samsung device, basically, right? Or the new iPhone. The iPhone 6 Plus, right? So that's essentially what a single-page application is. Now, you don't want to go build one of these single-page applications all on your own. You don't want to do every single bit of the coding. Why? Because it's a lot of work. There's a lot of things that you need to take into account, like routing or navigation. I want to have a way to get from screen to screen. We used to think of it as page to page, but we're really saying we want to go from this screen to this screen, or from this experience to that experience. I don't want to code all that stuff up. I want to have a nice routing framework. And what these different SPA frameworks do for us is they use some extra stuff on the end of the URL to figure out where we should go. SharePoint 2013, I just released a brand new product. SharePoint 2013 is it uses some of this same style. You know, when you go to the homepage of a team site, it goes to start.aspx, and then it's got a hash sign, / and it takes you to the homepage. The stuff after the hash symbol is what the actual page you're going to, and that start.aspx is like a little loader, and it's what's going to pull everything down. All right? We also want to have a way to do deep linking. Well, if you're going through a web application, I want to be able to send you a link that's going to take you right back to that screen with that data loaded, that customer data loaded, inside of my application. I don't want to tell you, okay, first go log in, then click on this, then click on this, then click on this. No, I want to give you a deep link to it. And I can do those kinds of things with these different frameworks. I want to have a way to have nice templated views, and maybe even have a way to pre-compile my views where I can take all the HTML, I can convert it to JavaScript and minimize it, and then string them all together, unify them down to simplify the download that's going to be going to my clients. And I need to have a good way to do data binding. I don't want to sit there and have to say, do the jQuery style of things, which is go find this element and go put this first name data element inside of this input box. It's ridiculous, right? Instead, I want to say bind that text box to this property on this object, so when that object's property changes, the text box changes. I don't want to worry about figuring all that stuff out. There's different frameworks that do this for you. One of them is Angular, and Angular is a very popular, to me, it's the one that's kind of is winning or has won. Depends on your point of view, but it definitely is the one that's winning. Other ones that are out there are Durandal. The successor to Durandal is one called Aurelia. That one is still very young. It's by a guy that actually he did Durandal, he joined the Angular team for a while, then he left and went back to go do Aurelia. And then you see other ones out there like Ember. And there's some that is you would think that are small presentation frameworks, but they're really not. They're more just rendering engines. Like Facebook has one called React.js. That's really popular as well. I'm going to focus just on the Angular side of it. Now, why should you even care about this stuff? Why do you even care about this? Well, today when you build applications for SharePoint or for Office 365 or really anything, you really don't want to build your application to where it lives inside of that host. You don't want to do the same thing we did before, which is farm-based solutions in SharePoint. Or I'll just say farm-based solutions, because that's when our custom code is going to be running inside the process of SharePoint. Instead, I want all my custom stuff to get out of SharePoint. I want that stuff to either be running either in the client, in the browser, or it needs to run outside of SharePoint. Microsoft would like to tell you go stick it in Azure, but it can go anywhere, all right? Now, one of the cool things about doing single-page apps is that you don't have a whole lot of stuff that you've got to go host somewhere else. You've got a couple CSS files, a couple JavaScript files, a couple images maybe, but that's really it. You don't need any server-side stuff. You may want to have to build some server-side logic to host different custom RESTful services that can do some of the back-end hard processing of some of the data that you don't want to push out to the client, or you want to build RESTful services to protect your IP, and you don't want it to be sitting in JavaScript in the client, right? One of the things that's so nice about using single-page apps, let's talk specifically about a SharePoint app that you're going to build. You generally have two different ways of building a SharePoint app, either using something called the cloud application model, where stuff lives somewhere else, like in Azure, and there's a server-side component to it, and SharePoint simply redirects the user over to it, or you want to have a SharePoint-hosted app where all of the content, all the CSS, HTML, JavaScript, is going to be saved inside of SharePoint. As far as a single-page app goes, it doesn't matter. All that stuff can be saved inside of SharePoint in a SharePoint-hosted app, in a sandbox solution. It can be hosted somewhere else. It doesn't matter. The thing about this that I like about it is that it really dumbs down and really simplifies your deployment story. And the other thing I really like about this is that this stuff has nothing to do with SharePoint. The reason why that's such a good thing is because the talent pool that is out there and the resource pool and the knowledge and the ability and where all the innovation is happening these days is web. It's not happening on the server-side stuff. It's all happening web. Since we started this talk, there have been another 150 JavaScript libraries that have been released on GitHub, I'm sure, right? And some of them are even trending already on Twitter. There's always something new. I don't know if you guys subscribe to like the GitHub, like What's Happening newsletter. It's almost worthless because by the time the thing comes out, they've processed the stuff like from 2 days ago, and it's like all this new stuff comes out. Try and watch Hacker News. Like, did you see what was on Hacker News today? Like, no. What time? Because at 9:30 it was totally different than 9:15, right? From the new library that's out there. So this is where all the innovation is happening. All this stuff is happening on the web and on the client side, right? So there's a couple different ways that you can build out your app. You can do it using Visual Studio and SharePoint hosted apps. I've got one that I'll show you in just a minute with the code that you can download. Or you can use really any tool that you want. Now, I'm going to be a little brave here. I did a little survey of some of the speakers before I did this talk. We have a little Yammer network for the speakers at this conference. And I knew what I was going to do, but I wanted to see what kind of a negative reaction I would get. And I was like, so what do you guys think? Do you think I should do a live demo showing stuff using an editor that's not Visual Studio? Or do you think everybody will be like, oh my gosh, no, no, no? Or do you think it's cool to go through and do a different one? And I got some pretty strong sentiment going, no, don't use use Visual Studio, don't use something else because it'll be confusing to people and all that stuff. I'm like, really? I've been to this conference before. And the people in the dev track are smart people. Usually this room is not the smart room. This is the IT pro room, right? Usually it's the dev room. Usually it's the other room that's finished. So I was a little worried. I was like, oh, I hope the IT pro, so there's an IT pro in here going, wait a minute, where's he going to show like the start button? But, so, you can use any editor that you want. My personal preference for building web applications these days is not using Visual Studio. And it's not just because I'm on a Mac. It's using a tool called WebStorm. And it's not free, but it's a killer web editor. It's the best JavaScript developer environment you'll find, at least in my mind. We'll see when like the Visual Studio 2015 comes out and how good the JavaScript stuff is. But I like WebStorm because it's super lightweight, super fast, whatever. But just know that what I'm going to show you is nothing specific to WebStorm. They're just text files. It's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And you can do it in a SharePoint app. You can do it in a non-SharePoint app. You can do it in 365, live it in Azure, have the thing hosted in AWS, have it hosted in Heroku. It doesn't matter. Heck, you could use Notepad to build this entire thing out if you really like to do self-inflicting of pain. All right. So this is some of the flexibilities of SPAs here. So possible to create an online or an offline story. The second one right there, this is really cool. So I did this for one of my customers where we wanted to be able to build the application, but we wanted to test what the experience was going to be like, and we wanted to modify the app based on user experience. And so we sat down and we spec'd out what they wanted, got the whole thing ready to go, and then they said, we have this one feature that's really important, right? And so they came out with it, we spec'd the whole thing, it's super important, and this is how it's got to be implemented because we know our users. It's like, okay. Everyone thinks they really know their users until they get them doing stuff, and they're like, that's not what they told us. Like, no, they're users. They don't know what they want, right? They show us what they want by the way that they act. So we built the app. We set it out, put it out there, and we were tracking the usage of this one feature, right? We saw that in the first 2 weeks of this app being rolled out, regardless of the device or the browser they were using, we saw that they only had about 15% of the users were using this feature that was the absolute most critical and most important feature for this application. 15% were using it. So I was talking with one of the guys on there, one of the guys at the client, and I was like, do you guys mind if we run a little experiment? He's like what? I said, well, here's what we're going to do. It's a cool capability you have in the Google Webmaster Tools for doing A/B testing, which is essentially saying, I want, for everyone that makes a request to this thing right here, the Webmaster Tools say, some people are going to get A, some people are going to get B, and we'll test and see which one is more popular. So what we did is we kind of re-engineered how the feature worked and how it was manifested and surfaced in the application. And overnight, literally overnight, because they were a client in Australia, for me it was overnight, it was them in the middle of the day, we saw the usage of that feature for the B test that got our customizations. We saw it skyrocket to 87% were now using the feature, just by making one little tweak, right? The other users were still getting the old experience. So all we had to do was go right in and say, now we're going to use B from now on, and poof, the utilization skyrocketed. And the coolest part about the whole thing is we never had to deploy any new code or anything because we anticipated that this one JavaScript file and this one HTML fragment was going to have to change. So we pulled them live from the Webmaster Tools on an A/B test. It was just running A the whole time at the beginning. Then we put A/B up. B was winning, so we killed A and just said, now just start using B. No new deployment. Reacting to our customers' usage and how they were using the application live, which was pretty slick. The last 2 points there, some of these are, the first one, let's see, point number 3 about a deep talent pool to choose from. Some of you are probably going to look at this and say, really, that's not a good thing. But for those of you who are development managers in here will say, yes, that's awesome. But some of the developers will be like, yeah, you're moving my cheese. Here's the thing. Web development is a very broad skill these days. If you need a SharePoint skill set, well, to me, that skill set is doing this right now. Does that mean that you're going to lose your jobs as a SharePoint developer? Absolutely not, right? But it's not going to go away anytime soon. It's still not going to be there. But that's not where the innovation is happening. The web developers are where the innovation is happening. When I'm trying to staff a project these days and bring some people in to build something for a client, I'm not looking for SharePoint devs because that, number one, that always jacks up the price by about $75 an hour. I want web developers. Do you know OAuth? Do you know HTML and CSS and JavaScript? Do you know any of these presentation frameworks? And do you know how to do REST? Yes to all of those? Sweet. There's a ton of you guys out there, and it's a lot cheaper to get those people, and it's a lot easier to find the resources and help when you need to figure something out. So there's a very deep pool to choose from. The last point here about a booming ecosystem. The reason I like Angular so much, Angular is one of these SPA presentation frameworks. I like it because it's backed by a big company, right? It's backed by Google, but it's got a tremendous amount of community involvement. The team has grown 2 to 3x is what it was last year. One of those multipliers came all the way from the community, and there are companies that are actually putting people on Google's Angular team that are their own employees working at these other companies, but they're full-time working on Angular, not being paid by Google. There are so many different things that are popping up that integrate into Angular, and then you look at all the conferences that are out there going on, and they're all exploding left and right, right? They're interested in this stuff, and I can attest to what Jeremy was saying in the keynote about these Angular and Google developers. They're interested in this Office 365 stuff. They're interested in it because they see that this is where enterprises are going. Either if you're on-prem or in 365, it doesn't matter. They see enterprise dev and enterprise content is in these different repositories. They want to go build applications there. Why? Because it translates to this in their pockets, right? Translates to money in their pockets because they see they're working with the enterprises and not working on open source stuff, which is going to pay a lot better. So there's a selfish reason to it as well. They're very interested in it. It was crazy to see how fast they were building Office Office add-ins. We had an Excel and an Outlook add-in that they built in about 2 hours, all on their own as Angular apps. That's pretty slick. All right, so really quick, let me just talk about a few supporting technologies, and then I'm going to dive into some of these demos here. I think we started at 10 o'clock, didn't we? So 10 to 11, okay. So a couple of things here. Let's talk about some of the supporting technologies you want to think about. You don't have to use TypeScript. It's totally up to you. The demos I'm going to show you here, I've got 3 demos. One of them that's pre-built is written all in TypeScript. What is TypeScript? It is a superset to JavaScript. Think about it as, for those of you, how many of you are server-side developers, like C# developers and VB guys? Okay, how many of you, now, and be honest, because the answer is always the same, so I can tell if you're lying. How many of you are really good JavaScript developers? Yes, I know this stuff. Now, how many of you are JavaScript developers like me, which is, I've just been hacking my way through it for the last decade? Yeah, see, here's what's cool about TypeScript. It's C# and JavaScript, because it basically lets you do strong typing, classes, interfaces, and what's cool about that stuff is that that's where the JavaScript is going. We're going to get classes in ECMAScript 6. That's coming. You can write that stuff in TypeScript today. TypeScript compiles down to ES6, which we generally see as JavaScript today. And there's a little toggle we can flip and say, nope, now I want to compile down to ECMAScript 6, which will be the next version of JavaScript. That'll come out in the next year. And some of the browsers already have different levels of support with ECMAScript 6 in it. But what's cool is that you can write that stuff today. You can write that code today in TypeScript, and it will compile it down to JavaScript, but nice strong typing. Visual Studio's got a good interface for it. WebStorm's got a good interface for it. And it's even a place where Google and Microsoft are collaborating now on TypeScript. You'll see more about that next week at Build, or you'll hear more about that at Build next week. You also want to have a good browser development tool. Now, me personally, I think that the Chrome developer tools in the Google Chrome browser are second to none. Specifically, they blow away all of the profiling and performance stuff that you'll find in Firefox or Internet Explorer today. They're absolutely awesome. There's an add-on called Batarang that is a thing that you can add on to your dev tools that gives you some more inspection and visibility into your Angular apps inside the dev tools. Fiddler, this is a must tool these days. Absolute must when you're doing web dev. You have to know what Fiddler is. It's an HTTP debugging proxy. Lets you create requests, monitor the requests, see the response coming back. This tool, this is the most important tool to you because when you're doing current web dev, you're doing so many calls, not only to REST, but you're doing a lot of OAuth style authentication. And you want to see the stuff that goes back and forth because when something breaks, the error messages never tell you what the real problem is. But if you look at what's coming back in Fiddler, it almost always tells you exactly what you need. Haha, we came back. The last thing here is something called Breeze. What is that? So you're working with REST. You're like, oh, I hate building up all these requests and everything. I have a session later this week where I'm going to talk about REST. Todd Bleeker's got a session where he's going to talk about REST. And then I'm going to take it to the next level, and we'll talk about batching. But I'm also going to talk about Breeze. If you're familiar with Entity Framework, this is basically JavaScript's implementation of Entity Framework, or a JavaScript implementation of Entity Framework, all living in the client. So client-side caching, validation, not having to write all the plumbing, blah, blah, blah. I'll talk about that later this week. Now, the last thing before I jump into the demos, project organization. Now, this picture's from Visual Studio, but it's going to apply to anything. It apply to any editor that you're going to use. What you don't want to do, in any technology you're going to use for getting external libraries into your project, In the Microsoft world, we use something called NuGet, right? Everybody's familiar with NuGet. So NuGet is a very opinionated packaging system where all scripts go here, all CSS goes here. You have to do it everything, all the files go in a space that NuGet is already defined, and there's nothing that you can really do to change that. There are other packaging systems that are out there that Microsoft has already seen that are very popular in the web development space, and they're adding support for them in the next version of Visual Studio, Visual Studio 2015. There's one called NPM for the Node Package Manager. That's like the JavaScript implementation of NuGet. But the one for client-side devs that you really want to watch is one called Bower, B-O-W-E-R. Bower is think about it as NuGet, but primarily for client-side scripts. You'll see a lot of places now, like when you want to get Angular, you can go get it from NuGet, you can go get it from a NuGet package, you can go get it from Bower. Most of the time, it makes more sense to use Bower to get it. Why? Because you can choose where all the stuff gets deployed, okay? The reason I'm showing you this slide here is that you want to be consistent. Now, this is my opinion on how you should structure your project, but don't walk away and say, oh, I have to do it the way Andrew said it. No, no, no. Look past what I'm saying and say, oh, I need to think about how I'm going to put stuff in my project, and I need to keep things separate. Generally, when we're doing a server-side project, all of our server-side references always go inside of this references folder, like where that red box is up there for references, right? If you look a little bit farther down, whenever I'm doing JavaScript stuff, all my JavaScript third-party libraries go inside of a scripts folder. So the project you see on the left is a farm solution. No, that's just a standard website, standard ASP.NET MVC website. The project on the right is a SharePoint-hosted app. So there's no references piece there because you can't do server-side code. But the red boxes signify external libraries. So external server-side libraries are in references, external client-side libraries are in scripts. What I would recommend that you do is don't put your stuff inside of scripts if you're doing client-side apps. Why? Because you're mixing your stuff with third-party stuff, right? And then it's hard to figure out what's what. You want to do a minification of everything where you take all your JavaScript and shrink it all down to where it's not readable and then concatenate all the files together for performance reasons. You want to do that for vendor libraries separate from your application code that you're doing. Plus, it's easier to find your stuff. I like to put my application inside of a folder called app that you see there listed in both those pictures. All right? Doesn't matter where you put it, just keep it separate. I'd recommend that you keep it separate. All right? So let's go ahead and let me jump into a demo, and let's build an application here. So what I'm going to do is I have an application here called Bare Bones. Now, I'm going to show you what the project structure looks like, and don't worry, I'm going to make the code go a lot faster. Now, this app has already been built out, and it's in that GitHub repository. I'm going to try and build it on the fly. We're going to build our first Angular app from scratch. Now, this editor is called WebStorm. Really, the only difference is the colors from Visual Studio and the fact that the File Explorer is not on the right side, it's on the left side. Okay? That's the only thing that's different. So looking at the files over here, this is a standard way of how I would organize my project. So index.html, that's the home page of the application. That's like the shell that's going to host everything. What this guy is going to do is we're going to have this thing log in with Azure Active Directory JS, which is essentially a client-side authentication library that the Azure Active Directory team has built for us, and allows us to authenticate 100% client-side. Once we log in, we're then going to have a view that shows us a list of all the employees in a SharePoint list, and then we'll just see a list of all those employees. And we can create detailed views and stuff like that later. We're just going to focus on just that one list. So how do we log in? How do we get the app to load? How do we get data? How do we show it? Index.html, that's the host. The home directory right there where it says home.html, that is a certain view. So that's going to be the main part of my view on what's going to be injected in the main section of my application. Employees folder, there's two things. There's a view for employees.html. That's the fragment of how I want the list to be displayed. And then employees controller.js, think MVC, model view controller. That's the controller for my employees view. How is he going to get his data? He's going to get his data from the data context.js. That's my data access layer that's going to talk to the SharePoint REST API. Now, For the whole thing to start out, though, is I'm going to have to work inside of app.module. That's what's going to define my application, okay? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to build out app.module. So I'm going to come over here, back out, and I'm going to switch to presentation. Oh, I'm going to switch to toggle presentation mode. Okay, so here's where we're going to start. Now this syntax you see right here, for those of you who aren't as familiar with JavaScript, this is called an IFI, an immediately inline invoking function. Basically, this says that don't put this code in the global scope of the browser. We're going to create a little miniature scope inside and then add our application code and let it run to go build up the application. If you put it in the global scope, that's like putting like you have a window object in the HTML DOM. You don't want to put stuff on that because that's where the standard, you just don't want to put stuff in the global scope. I'll just leave it at that. All right, let's not go into the details of that stuff. All right, so what I want to do first is we're going to go ahead and we're going to build our Angular application. So to do that, I'm going to say var, create a new variable called app, and I'm going to say angular.module, because we build these things called, each thing in Angular is going to load. We can have one or more modules. We're going to keep it simple and just have one, and we're going to call ours app. Now, inside of that, I'm going to then need to specify some stuff that I want to inject into this module. Angular at its core has implemented dependency injection to make it incredibly easy to test. So what I have to do is I have to tell it what things I want to inject in here. What that lets me do with during testing is it lets me put mock things in there to do better testing. Now, there's really just two things I'm going to want to put in. I'm going to inject into this. One is going to be called ng-route, and one is going to be called ADAL Angular. So what that's going to do is it says, I'm going to inject in the route module and something else called the ADAL Angular. The second one comes from the Azure Active Directory team. I have a reference to the script library in the HTML, index.html, and what that's going to do is it's going to essentially give me the ability to do Azure Active Directory authentication stuff inside of my application. So once I've done that, my Angular app has actually now been created. Now, it's not doing anything yet. The next thing I'm going to want to do is I want to go in and set up the security stuff for the application. So let's set up how the login is going to work. So this is going to be app.config. And what I want to do now is I need to inject in a few things into this config. So Angular is going to load these at runtime. I'm going to have things like a HTTP provider. And I'm also going to have the ADAL authentication service provider. Hopefully I'm typing that okay and not screwing that up. Authentication, right? That looks better. If not, I can pull a Julia Childs because it's already built. I'll just pull it right out of the oven and say, look, it's done. We'll do that later. Okay, so I got those two done. Now the next thing I need to do here is I need to define the function that Angular is going to call on this config. So what work is going to be done? So let's come down here to the next line and let's just write a function that's going to take in these two parameters being passed in. So HTTP provider and ADAL provider. We'll just call it those two. The names don't have to match. The reason why you put the names up here is because when you do minification, these variables right here are going to change. And this tells Angular you're looking for something by this name, which strings won't change, but variable names will change when you do minification. Okay, so now I've got this. There's my app. So we've got our config all written up. Now let's handle the security. So how are we going to do this? So I'm going to set up ADAL. So the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to say ADAL provider dot init, and then he's got I'm passing it a function, but I want to pass an object into this function. So there's a couple things I want to pass in on this. I'm going to pass in a tenant. I'm going to want to pass in a client ID. I'm going to want to pass in a logout, post logout redirect URL, and we'll just make that HTTP localhost 8000. And then finally, I need to set up some endpoints. Now, what is this going to do? What this authentication provider, what this thing does is that it's going to automatically require that I log in. If I go to a screen that says login required, it's going to look to see if I make any requests for a specific site, for a specific RESTful endpoint. And if I do, it'll automatically attach the the OAuth access token, the bearer token, into the request. So I don't have to worry about dealing with the authentication stuff. Now, actually, instead of typing all this stuff out, because I'd rather show you guys more demos in this and you guys watching me type this stuff along, let me switch back and let me show you this guy that's already built out and kind of explain all the code for this. So that's over here, but again, you probably didn't, oh, you can see that, but that's it's gonna go flaky when I go to presentation mode. So we'll just take you, put you right there, and let's switch to, no, it's not in this one. It's in, let me open up that right project file. Open, recent, bare bones. That was the bare bones we were just doing. Open, demo, bare bones. And let's look at the module. So let's see how this guy came out. All right, so down here, this is the code that I was just writing here. There's my ADAL provider. This tenant ID, that's the ID of my Azure Active Directory tenant. The client ID is the name of my application I've created in Azure AD. I'll show you that in a minute. And then the endpoint says, I'm watching for a request that starts with that request. So HTTPS ACI 036503.sharepoint.com/slides. You see it. Goes through all that. It says, when you see a URL that starts with that, I want you to add in the access token to it. Now, the other thing that I had to also set up is what my navigation looks like inside of my Angular app. And I'm doing that using a route provider. Now, the route provider is a service in Angular, and it says, tell me all of the different navigation routes that you can go to. And when I see somebody make a request for that URL, then I know how to construct the page. So that first one says, hey, when you go to the home page of the application, just when the URL is / I want you to load in the template called home.html, and here's where you'll find it. Now, I'll show you where that goes in just a minute. But, and notice that there's nothing else on that route. There's nothing else on this route right here. But on the next route, where I'm going to /employees, I'm going to give it a little more information. I'm going to tell it, here's the view I want you to go to, employees.html. But once you go there, I want you to create an instance of this controller that we've defined, and I want you to alias this controller inside of the view called VM for view model, right? So you're familiar with the MVC or MVVM pattern. And then finally, the last parameter right there is coming from Azure Active Directory's Angular provider that says, should they be required to log in here? Now, if they have not already logged in, it'll take them over to Azure AD, they will log in, and then it will send them back over here to this application, to this route. If they did not successfully log in, then Azure is going to tell them that, hey, your login is not successful, okay? And then at the very end there, it says, otherwise, if someone tries to go to any URL inside of this application, and it's not one that we recognize, just send them to the home page. So you can have a nice friendly 404. So where is this stuff all going to go? So all this stuff, let's come over here and let's look at index.html. So what have I done over here? What I've done over here is all I did is I added in a few extra script libraries. Now, I've only added in, we've only just shown you app.module.js, but you see there's 2 other JavaScript files that I'm going to reference as well. Now, how do you get the Angular app to load? That's all going to happen up on line 6. I have an attribute on the body tag that says, I want you to load an application called app. Remember when I said angular.module, and then in parentheses, I said app, and then I injected the route and the ADAL provider in it? I told Angular we have an application called app. It's kind of meta, right? What's this app called? It's called app. Okay. That's where Angular says, okay, I'm going to bind this whole thing to the body tag. Where are all the views for this application going to go? Where does home.html go when they go to that page? Where does employees.html go? It's going to go inside of a div on line 8 because I've told Angular that's where the view is with ng-view. ng is the short syntax for Angular. You don't have to put that data dash in there. That just makes it a valid HTML5 attribute. You could just say ng-view. It would still work. It just won't pass some of the HTML5 validation stuff. And then I just created a link there to say, here's how you get from the home page to the employees view. Okay, that's all good. Now, once I've done that, oop, I just killed the line. Don't do that. Once I've done that, let's take a look at what the employees view looks like. So what this guy does, he's got a little Angular stuff in there as well. Now remember, I have a controller that's being bound to this, right? So what I've done is I have a controller that's been bound to this. It's been bound as a variable called VM. So the controller object that I'm going to show you in a second is VM. Up there on the list item, I've used a repeat directive from Angular that says you're going to create as many list items inside of this list that you see in the collection called employees that's sitting on the VM object on the controller. So my job in the controller, when the controller gets instantiated, is to go get a bunch of employees and put them inside of a collection called employees. I'm going to enumerate through that, and for each one that I hit inside the employees collection, I'm going to call it employee. And then you see there on the line where the cursor is, apparently it's got a good idea with a little light bulb next to it. I'm using an Angular data binding syntax that says, I want you to bind the title property to this area right here on the list item. So we're just going to write out the title of this person, all right? Which I think is their full name. I'm using a syntax here where you see that colon, colon. The data binding piece is only the mustache brackets, the double mustache brackets on either side. The colon, colon at the beginning is something we got in Angular 1.3. That's a one-way binding. I have no interest to see if this changes because it's just a list item. It's not a text box. So it's not going to set up any kind of extra code to say, let's see what happens when this changes, and I'll update the object. It's a cool performance trick, right? So I'm just saying do a one-way data binding. You're just going to write it out. So what does the controller look like? So the controller, I'm going to define the controller right here. This is in controller, employee.controllers.js. I'm going to create a new controller here called ng_barebones.employeeController. And if you recall, that's the name of the controller that I listed in my route that says when you go to /employees, here's the controller I want you to load. When this JavaScript file got loaded in the browser, Angular went and he ran this code, he processed it, and he has an internal memory that says, here's a list of all my controllers, there's a controller with that name. So when someone goes to the /employees view, or /employees page, it will take them to, it'll take the employee.html file out, it'll put it in the view, it'll take this controller, it's going to call the constructor for this controller that's defined on line 10, build that out, and hand that back as an object, okay, to the view. In here, I'm going to inject just one thing. I'm going to inject in the data context. That's going to be a service that we'll look at in a minute. That's how we're going to get our data. And then I say, so what happens? The last parameter in the definition of the controller is going to go build the actual controller object. So in there, I'm passing in the data context on line 10. I'm going to get an internal reference to the controller by just saying var equals this. I don't know about you, but the stuff in JavaScript where it's like everything is called a this and then that changes. Sorry, you can't say that because that means something too. But it's like this and that and me and this loses context once I have like an anonymous function. Then this is now inside of that anonymous function or inside the callback and then another. It's crazy. So people call it me or they call it that or us or self. I just call it VM because it doesn't seem so personal, right? Don't want to get personal in a conference session, right? Don't want to start telling jokes about race or religion or that kind of stuff, right? So. At least I don't think you want to. So let's go create a new collection object. So I'm going to create a new public collection called employees, and it's an empty object. It's got nothing on it. So when my repeater on the view goes to run, it's not going to show anything in there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a function called activate. And what that does is it's going to be, this style here, you may look at it and say, is that really necessary? Couldn't I put it all right there? Yeah, you could. This is the way I like to style my apps, is when the controller gets created, once everything's done with the initialization, I like to activate it. So I have a function called activate, and that's where all of my work happens on the front end, right? So, the next thing that's going to happen, that was weird. It was a sound, I couldn't tell if it was a sound guy. Came in and was doing like this. I thought he was giving me a thumbs up, but he was doing like a measurement of the room or something. So the next thing, so we'll look at our activate function called getEmployees. So what is he going to do? He's going to call a function on my data context called getEmployees. That's going to return a JavaScript promise. That promise is going to have a collection of all the results. You want to work with promises. It's a way in JavaScript because it's a way of controlling asynchronous stuff. So you can say, do this, do this, do this, do this, and you can wait for all of them to happen, or you can chain them together. So if you're not familiar with promises, you definitely want to go take a look at that. I've written this to return a promise. I'll show you how I do that on the next code snippet. The result coming from get employees is going to give me that result, and I'm going to bind that to the employees collection. So I need to give it back a collection of employees. If there's an error, you see I put the error down there, or we're not going to get an error, so we're good. Right, we'll probably get an error now that I've said that. Now let's look at the data context. This is the last part here. All right. So what this guy's going to do is we're going to create a data context. This is not going to be a controller. This is going to be an Angular service. Think about this. Think about it like this. A controller, you're going to get an instance of a controller every time the view is created. You're going to recreate the controller. A service is a singleton. It will be created one time in the application and not be created any more times. That reference will be kept the whole time. It's good for memory management. I'm going to pass in two Angular services, one for $HTTP, which is what you use to make requests, make AJAX-style requests. And then $Q is a implementation of the popular promise library called Q that the Angular team wrote that only has stuff that's specific that Angular needs. So I'm going to come down here and pass those in. I'm going to have a base endpoint for my API. So it's going to be at this SharePoint site _API. I'm going to return, my service is going to have a public signature where it has a single function called get employees, that when that's called, it will call the function get employees that you see listed right here on line 17. Now I'm going to create a promise. It's a deferred object. So I'm going to go to Q, $Q, and I'm going to say, go create a deferred object, and now go make the HTTP request to the RESTful service in SharePoint. So I'm going to go create the endpoint there. We've all seen how to do RESTful stuff. If you haven't, go check out Todd Bleeker's session, I think later today, where he talks about REST. And then on line 13, I'm going to say, let's issue a request. So this is similar to jQuery.ajax. If you use that for doing your AJAX calls, $HTTP is Angular's implementation of that. As just a little footnote, you don't want to cross using jQuery and Angular together because Angular has a lot of things that it's monitoring and watching. If you step outside of that boundary, it doesn't know what's going on over here. And so when this thing over here completes, Angular has no idea that it's completed, so it can't do like some good memory management and know when to detect when things have changed. So you don't want to use like jQuery to make AJAX calls. You want to use Angular style of doing it because Angular knows when those things are finished. Now, I'm going to go through, method is a get, there's the URL we're going to, standard accept header, and when this succeeds, there's the results that are going to come back in this response. I'm then going to look at my deferred object and say we're going to resolve the promise, meaning promise is done. I'm going to look at the response that came back, and I know it's got a property of D, and it's got a collection of employees coming back on the results property. This right here, this value right here, is what goes back to my method on my controller that was pulling that data back. And then finally at the bottom, I'm just going to return the promise back to whoever called it. That's where I could say, go get the employees .then. So when .then would say when that resolves, take the stuff that was from here and inject it into that anonymous function. Cool? All right. So let's see if the internet gods are going to be friendly to me right now. And let's run this guy. Nope, that ain't going to work. Let's try that again. So you're supposed to debug. You are supposed to launch that right there. And why didn't you launch that? Go. Let's try again. Let's try something else. Oh, love it. Employee HTML, you're supposed to load. You're supposed to go Chrome URL index on the root. And you're supposed to just be able to do that, and you're supposed to go, and you're not doing it, and you're seeing my entire machine. This is great. Ha, lovely. So what would happen? Ha, know what?
I still have the PC.
No, nice. I still have the PC. Okay, you know what? We have 5 minutes left, so let me do this. That one does work, I promise. In the repo, it explains how to go through and get it running and everything. I had to do a really quick setup for this one for the stuff, so I didn't get to do a couple of things I want to do to get it to set up before we got started. At any rate, let me jump. So there's in the demo, in the repository that you're going to go look at, that you guys are going to have access to, there are going to be a few things. There are a few demos here. NG Bare Bones is the one we just were running through that you guys can go take a look at, okay? That's all done. I did it in WebStorm, but it doesn't matter what editor. You can open it up in anything, get that running on localhost, and you're good to go. The one at the top called Expense Manager is pretty cool because that one is a 100% client-side thing that talks to Azure Active Directory to authenticate. It uses the Office 365 Files API to find your files in OneDrive, and it uses the SharePoint REST API to get data out of SharePoint lists. Shows it all as an expense manager. We did this one at the Angular conference back in March. That's all 100% client-side. The Learning Path Manager is another one that I have that you might have seen me do this one at a previous Evolutions conference. But what this one is a full Visual Studio-based solution. And what this one is it's all a SharePoint hosted application, looks like SharePoint, runs like SharePoint, all the code's in there, all done using Angular to go talk to SharePoint lists and to give your users a different, a nicer experience in working with data inside of SharePoint. So that's showing you a SharePoint application, SharePoint hosted app over here. These two are things that can live outside of SharePoint to run. In the repository, you can go grab all of that stuff, okay? Let me just real quickly wrap it up wrap up my slides. Always fun going first right after the keynote when they run over. Oh, there we go, okay. So let me talk a little bit about the differences between where we are today with Angular, just real briefly. If you want to see more information on this, I'll have some stuff for you later on today or tomorrow if you just watch my blog. It's just andrewconnell.com. So where are we today? Well, right now, the current version of Angular is 1.3. 1.4 will come out sometime in the next few weeks. It's available as a release candidate right now, but it's coming out very soon. Last October, Google came out and they said, hey, Angular 2 is coming, and they did an absolutely horrible job of explaining it because they put all these tombstones up showing all the stuff we're doing today isn't going to be there tomorrow. And everyone started freaking out, and they had no follow-up. Let me just explain it like this. Think about it as what we're doing today with Angular. A lot of people looked at that and they said, oh my God, all the stuff we're building today is going to have to be thrown away. We're going to have to rewrite everything. Well, not really. Here's the thing. Look at Angular the way it is today and Angular 2 the same way we looked at ASP.NET Web Forms and ASP.NET MVC. ASP.NET Web Forms worked great, still works great, still supported, and there's still a lot of people doing ASP.NET Web Forms. But we all saw the light. We all saw that, hey, MVC is really the path forward, and that's really how we should be building web applications going forward. So how are they doing that? Microsoft came out with ASP.NET MVC, and there was a pretty steep learning curve. Was there a migration story from ASP.NET Web Forms to ASP.NET MVC? No, not really. You had to rebuild the app. Did you have to? No. The existing app worked just fine, so there's nothing wrong with it, right? Was there incentive to move to MVC? Yes. Think about that in the exact same way you think about this. There's a lot of reasons why Angular 2.0 is going to be so much better than Angular 1. It's still under development today. You can't build an app with Angular 2 unless you really have the special sauce and you know exactly how to go through the entire build process, because it's still a conglomerate, it's still a collection of lots of different modules all pulled together, okay, to build up one framework. And it's not easy to go through the build process. It is tremendously faster. It is much more friendly for mobile stuff. It has a lot of the stuff we do in Angular with all these directives, like ng repeat and all these other ones. They had an epiphany to where with the data binding, they're going to be able to cut out about 25 of the different Angular-specific things because there's just HTML5 things that we didn't know that we did. Like, for example, and one of the big controversies around Angular 2 is around the data binding syntax. Did you know in HTML, every object has a bunch of properties? You're like, yeah, I knew that, right? And when you represent them in HTML on the file, you have attributes, right? Like, yeah, I knew that. Did you know that a lot of those attributes, did you know that a lot of those properties don't have matching attributes? Like every single object in HTML has a disabled property. You can't, but not every single HTML tag has a disabled attribute. If you set the disabled property to true through JavaScript on any object in HTML, it goes away. In Angular, we have a thing called ng-hide and ng-show. We don't need those anymore. We just have to have a way to bind to it. And so you'll see things with like the Angular 2 syntax, data binding syntax, where instead of them saying disabled equals true, you have square bracket disabled equals true. Because the square brackets, it's valid HTML, but you're binding to a property, you're not writing an attribute, right? It's a much more performant thing. It's different, it's new, so of course we all look at it and be like, it doesn't look good, right? Just leave your open mind to it. It's crazy fast. The other thing too about Angular 2 is you may not really care about it because you may be using IE9 or IE10. Angular 2 will only work in evergreen browsers, Chrome, Firefox, and it's only going to be available in IE11. All right? I'm giving you a couple other references here if you want to see where you can grab from my slides. Those 2 videos there are from keynotes from a conference at NGConf. The first keynote from day 1 talks about the state of where we are and going from 1 to 2 if you're doing stuff with Angular. The second keynote is all about Angular 2 specifically, so diving into a lot more depth there. Highly recommend those. And there's a really good podcast where one episode called the State of Angular with the team that I would recommend you listening to. The podcast is called Adventures in Angular. The episode was the State of Angular. And it's with the guys from the Angular team, Igor, Mishko, Brad Green, the project manager, and stuff like that. All right? So some of this, like every dev session, there might be somebody in the room that's just kind of like, what the hell did I just sit through, right? You may feel like that guy in the middle, right? Which is perfectly okay because I've sat through many sessions like that before. But again, I want to give you the links there. You can go grab the repository. We can go download the stuff. I'm sorry I didn't show you the demo running. I'm frankly a victim of just trying to set up way too fast from the transition from the keynote, so I apologize for that. Actually, I stepped out of the room right before the keynote was over to go set up because I thought I was in the other room. And they're like, no, you're in this one. I'm like, oh. I had like the dongles and my clicker and all that stuff. I had everything in my pocket ready to go. I had the power cord and everything. And they're like, no, you're in here. You got to wait for them to finish. Like, oh. So, at any rate, I apologize for that. Yeah, thanks a lot for sticking around. Sorry I went a couple minutes over. And hope you guys enjoy the conference. If you have any questions, I'm going to break down so the next guy can set up. But I'm more than happy to answer questions. When he sets up, I'll go out in the hallway. As he's setting up, once I get my stuff out, I'll go out in the hallway and happy to talk to you, answer any questions about it. I love Angular. I love doing this stuff in SharePoint and 365. Microsoft is putting a lot of investment in it as well. A lot of samples up on their GitHub repository around Angular and SharePoint. I recommend you take a look, check it out. So thank you guys very much.